That doesn't mean that doesn't mean that it's the final outcome. That just means that's what the fact finder's opinion is based on reviewing all the information, all the viewpoints and perspectives that are provided by the union, but also by Chicago Public Schools. One thing that was agreed to between CPS and CTU that didn't mention earlier, but that they both want the contract to be a 4-year contract. That's not always been the case. Sometimes unions wanted shorter contracts, longer contracts, and vice versa with CPS, but both sides want a 4-year contract. And I think really the reason behind that is a desire to have stability, right? To have clear kind of working conditions for the next 4 years, but then still providing an opportunity to have some changes in the future. So not making it an 8-year contract or a 10-year contract, but 4 years is kind of being that sweet spot where it's stability. We have to come back to the negotiations for a couple of years, but still providing opportunities to make some changes in future years as well. Um, one of the biggest, I mean, the biggest kind of drivers or the reasons for the cost of the agreement is going to be something around the cost of living adjustment, so a COLA. And so some folks might be very familiar with the term COLA, but just to kind of unpack it for folks that might not be. So a COLA, a cost of living adjustment, is really supposed to kind of reflect inflation. So we know that inflation has been high over the last couple of years here in the United States, but also in Chicago more specifically. So what CTU originally proposed was asking for all salaries for CTU employees to be increased by 9% over the course of the 4 years to accommodate inflation. Now, they've since shifted to asking for 5% in each of the first 2 years of the contract, and I think either 4 or 5% in years 3 and 4 of the contract. CPS has proposed to have the first year of the agreement be 4% in the first year, and then it would be tied to inflation. So if inflation was higher, then CPS would actually pay the 5% in years 2, 3, and 4. If the inflation is a little bit lower, then it would be the lower number. And again, this is trying to just make sure because if you're getting paid $60,000, but the inflation is higher, then that $60,000 doesn't pay for what it paid for previously, right? If goods are going up, the house of cost of housing is going up, the house of groceries are going up. We've been hearing a lot about eggs, the cost of eggs in the news. So that is kind of the goal, the intent behind increasing or having this number subject to inflation. So ultimately what the fact finder recommended was decided with CPS and really like they were looking at the different cost the kind of the budget issues that CPS is facing and agreeing that 4% in year one and then 4 to 5% based on inflation in future years would be the right thing for CPS and CTU to agree to. You also have something within the contract that are called steps and lanes. This is like very, very specific to education. So kind of bear with me for a moment here, but steps increases. Think about steps like walking up a stairway. So as teachers reach certain years of experience, so your first year, second year, third year, fourth, there's different kind of milestone points in a teacher's kind of career working within Chicago Public Schools. So that certain um, times in that teacher's career, there's an increase in their salary that is triggered just by the number of years of experience. There's also things called lanes, which is when a salary gets increased for a teacher, or again, could be a counselor, could be a clerk, based on the additional education that they have or like their credentials that they have. So CTU wanted a major expansion of steps and lanes that would have cost CPS about $100 million over 4 years. Ultimately, what the fact finder recommended was similar to what CPS recommended, but it was a little bit more, closer to what CTU, but essentially to have $5 million per year set aside for increases for teacher steps and for teachers' lanes, which is similar to past agreements. So this would be for more experienced teachers or for teachers that are getting additional education or getting additional credentials. There's money that would be set aside to pay them more based on their years of service, but also their different kind of increasing their education or their credentials as well. So fact finder, it was closer to what CPS proposed, but still an expansion over the course. So I think when you think about like like a teacher's salary increase or a counselor salary increase, it is both that COLA, right, the cost of living adjustment, 4 to 5%, and then there's also as they get kind of years of service, there's also increases that come as well. A couple other things here. CPS, we would say kind of generally agree with CPS about and CTU around more staff for schools, but there's also some disagreements as well. So for folks, and I know Carrie's here. Carrie was part of this as a part of the local school council that she's at. There was a new way for CPS to fund schools, a new approach that really came into effect for this school year. And that is CPS is providing a minimum number of positions for every single school, regardless of enrollment. Previously, it was a student-based budgeting approach where schools received money specific, and then schools had to essentially buy positions, teacher positions, other positions as well. So what CTU wants out of this new funding model is that they want a commitment, a firm commitment that this will be the way that CPS funds schools moving forward. But CPS, while I think taking credit and feeling proud about this new approach to funding schools, wants flexibility if funding drops. They want to have more options available to them if funding, if they're kind of that state funding and the federal funding or even local funding goes down, they want to have some options. What the fact finder recommended is that the contract, they believe, should include a commitment to maintaining this, but there shouldn't be fixed staffing levels. So I think kind of providing a little bit of both. Like you provide the commitment, but you still want to give CPS some flexibility if overall funding to CPS declines. Librarians, big sticking point. There's not a lot of librarians within CPS. I know even at my children's school on Logan Square, there's like a parent worker that essentially kind of serves as the librarian within the school. CTU was asking for 30 new librarians every year over the course of the contract. CPS was offering 10 new librarians per year over the course of the 4-year contract. And the fact finder actually sided with CTU on this one. So said that 30 librarians per year is appropriate for CPS to be adding on a year-over-year basis, meaning there would be 120 new librarians over the course of the 4-year contract. Finally, there was some discussion around nurses, around teaching assistants, and ultimately the fact finder had no recommendation around those two positions specifically. A couple more kind of support staff type positions at schools. There was some conversation around the case managers, and essentially this is case managers who support students with individualized education plans, so IEPs. CTU was trying to get to a ratio of 1 case manager for every 65 students. CPS had 1 for every 70 students. Fact finder sided with CPS on that one. CPS is increasing counselors in high need schools, which is something that the fact finder recommended with CPS's decision to do that. There's also a position that's called a family engagement coordinator that exists at certain schools. And the fact finder found that CPS should be adding 2 more per year starting in year 2 of the contract. And then finally, this was somewhat of an agreement that CPS and CTU had kind of come to, I think, after they kind of entered the fact-finding process, but before the report came out, was essentially moving away from outside kind of like external kind of subcontractors to be a tech coordinator within schools. Yeah, especially all of our high schools have tech coordinators. They're helping out students and helping out the school community, and then to move to more in-house hiring of those positions. But I think this was one of those items where when they did the fact finding, kind of the interviews and kind of submitting documentation process, there was not an agreement. And I think by the end there was, and ultimately I think the fact finder kind of adopted that recommendation as well. So a whole bunch of things the fact finder made recommendations on, but there were 3 kind of key unresolved issues that the fact finder did not address in their report, and there are still outstanding issues, meaning that there has not been a resolution on it yet. One is around the elementary school day. So right now, CPS high school teachers get what was called a prep period. They get 2 prep periods per school day. Prep period is something that prep time is something that teachers use to prepare. And if you think about it, high school teachers especially, they're seeing a lot of kids every day, right? High school teachers, they might see 30 different kids for like 6 class periods over the course. So they might see, over 150 kids over the course of the day. So the prep time is really for the teacher to prepare, to think about, okay, I know that Hal's in this class, LaShawne's in this class, Evelyn's in this class. How am I going to kind of differentiate like the way that I teach, the different strategies that I'm using? I'm going to give some time to prepare during the day. Elementary level, they only get 1 prep period per day. And so the teachers union has been advocating to have originally the same amount of prep time for elementary school teachers and high school teachers. Now they're asking for about 20 additional minutes for elementary school teachers. What CPS is saying is, this is going to actually cost the district money because to have teachers, to have students that they're not with their kind of classroom teacher at that time, will require CPS to have to hire more staff or schools to hire more staff to essentially cover students during that time. So there's no agreement on that yet. CPS has offered 10 minutes of prep time extra for elementary school teachers. CTU has asked for 20 at this point. So hoping to find some sort of agreement there that gives teachers that need it more time, but also doesn't cost CPS extra money because, as we'll get to, CPS has some budget challenges this year, but also in future years as well. Something that CTU has been asking for is reduced class sizes in grades 4 through 8, so kind of our middle school grades, or kind of end of elementary school, kind of upper into middle school. And then they also want lower class sizes for high school electives. So think about high school electives are going to be things like art, music, even some extra classes that students have the choice of enrolling in when they're at the high school level. CPS wants a different approach for some of the lower grades, and they also and for high school as well. So they haven't quite gotten to agreement on what those class sizes. And this is like the difference between the union saying they want class sizes, one teacher for every 30 students, and the union and CPS saying we want it to be one for every 32 or something like that. So I'm still trying to get to agreement there. Again, class sizes change. That can also trigger additional costs for CPS as well. Finally, CTU has been claiming that there's some racial disparities in the teacher evaluation system. So every teacher within CPS gets evaluated by the school principal. That typically happens every 2 years. But CTU is claiming that certain teachers, particularly talking about Black male teachers specifically, they see lower ratings, and they believe that there's some racial bias that's included in the teacher evaluation system. And so they want a new system to evaluate teachers. CPS disagrees with the premise that the system itself is inherently has racial bias in it, but they are open to adjustments. So we'll see if the two sides can come to an agreement on that particular issue around teacher evaluations. So what comes next? We're in the middle of negotiations. The two sides are still negotiating. The fact finder has issued the report of recommendations, but they are just recommendations. However, while they are non-binding and they're just recommendations, they do help provide a possible path forward on several key issues. So I think even thinking about some of the things around like librarians, thinking about some of the things on steps and lanes, even the kind of the bit about salary, the COLA, the cost of living increases, you can see that the sides are pretty close, even elementary school planning time, pretty close to reaching an agreement. The CTU did reject the fact finder's report on February 6th. And what that means is that has now triggered a 30-day countdown in which CTU can then give the district a 10-day strike notice. So in 30 days from February 6th, they can notify CPS that they might take a strike vote within 10 days of that time. So I think what I've read from everything that I've seen, obviously from CTU leadership and the press and the media, I think we see from CPS leadership, nobody wants a strike. Nobody wants a strike right now. Families certainly do not want to strike. We do not want to have our children's education interrupted in the middle of the school year. And there's hope. There's hope that with this agreement on some of these things, like the length of the contract, housing initiatives, environmental improvements, sustainable community schools, and then how close the sides are on some of these economic issues, but also some of the non-economic issues, that hopefully we can avert a strike, an agreement can be reached, and we can have an agreement that treats our teachers union employees fairly. We'll also recognize some of the constraints that CPS is working under in terms of its budget as well. So the negotiations are ongoing right now in terms of those unresolved issues that were identified here. So that was a lot. Want to acknowledge that. Also want to, so if there's any questions or clarifications or any points that were made, if that can be helpful. I see there's a question here from Kristen Pollock. What happens if we can't fill the 120? Can everyone hear me? Sorry, I just got your internet connection's unstable message.
We can
If
hear
we
you
can't
now.
fill the 120, okay, I cut off for a second. So Kristen was asking what happens positions. So I think at the end of the day, what CTU looks at is not if the position is filled, but it is, did the position get created? And so CPS could still be in compliance with the agreements, with the contract, even if, let's say, a position for librarian is open at Brentano, where my kids go to school. If no one fills that position, if the school is trying and trying and trying and no one applies for it, it was still open. It was still an open position. It doesn't necessarily, it doesn't mean the position actually gets filled, which therefore the student don't actually get the benefit of it. So it is really about creating those positions as opposed to necessarily filling them. Hopefully that answers the question. But we can talk about any of these things that we just talked about, some of like with what was in the fact finders report. But is any also just any questions or concerns or just kind of open wonderings that we might have about these negotiations where they are right now? Because we are going to be shifting kind of focus areas now to be talking about kind of the implications, the budgetary implications afterwards. I think we can fairly say we all are very hopeful. Oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, like Baltasar, like he has his hand raised, so I'm giving him the mic.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank
Awesome.
you for giving me the mic. And one quick question. At Farragut High School here in Little Village, which I graduated from, it was called Farragut Career Academy. And we used
Mm.
to have auto shop. We used to have health occupation, architect, plumbing, electrician program, and all those programs were removed. And when I was in the local school council, we were trying to bring back the automotive program, but not just the automotive program, but be one of the first programs in the Chicago Public Schools for the new cars, the electrical cars, to be one of the first
Mm. Mhm.
cars that we could fix, electrical cars. So how can we get that type of funding for those programs? And also, now we have a clinic inside the school. And is there any way we could also bring, like, kids that want to become a nurse, a doctor, or they want to be in the medical field? Um, are those some things that they have talked about or talked about putting in
Yeah,
the
I mean,
budget?
what
Or
I would say is that, oh, sorry, I mean to cut you off.
Mm.
no, that's cool.
What I was doing was I was actually looking at my phone real quick because I was seeing, it is a great question, Balthazar. I think when they have an agreement on expanding CTE, they don't necessarily, current education programs, they don't necessarily identify the specific schools and the specific programs. So there is a commitment from CPS that might be like, we're going to expand it by X number of $1 million, generally. But I think there is a place for advocacy thereafter about the schools that receive that education and also the types of programs that the school does receive, right? It's not just, like, I think it's very important, I would say, to make sure that what that program that is that goes in is something that students actually want, right? And not just kind of current students at the school, but also even like the elementary school students that typically feed into Farragut, for example. I was looking at Farragut just real quickly. I have a little like CTE kind of guide, and it looks like Farragut right now looks like they have a teaching CTE program. They have a pre-law program, and then they have, it looks like an automotive technology program. So I'm curious, and again, this is a PDF of every high school in CPS, and what CT programs they have. So I'd be curious about that automotive one. And, you were talking about, we don't want it to be we want to look to the future. We want to think about, electric cars and, new technologies when it comes to automotive. Typically, critical education programming funding comes from both the federal government and also the state. But again, I think there will be an opportunity once this agreement is signed to, in your role in the Farragut Local School Council, to advocate that Farragut is a school. You're an alumni of the school, that when the school had a rich and strong and robust criminal education program, that you want to bring that back to Farragut and to advocate for the expansion of CTE programming and maybe even some ideas of what that programming should be. Typically, it might take a little bit of time not so much like to get the funding, but to actually like if you have to do something at the school to modernize the school facility to be able to accommodate that program, then sometimes it might take a little bit of like, they got to do like capital work in the same way we got to fix, our home or our apartment or something to make it more modern with a new kitchen or something like that. They've got to also make sometimes some capital improvements before that program can start. But certainly an opportunity to advocate, looking, I think, to next school year for new CT programs to come to Farragut. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, it was. Yes, it is.
All right. Any other questions or concerns or anything in the chat? And of course, please feel free to, you can always reach out to me or any of the team members that are here this evening if you have a question as well. Okay, we're going to get to our last portion of the discussion. And I hope it doesn't make everyone nervous or upset or sad, but we want to think about how does this agreement impact CPS's budget? And when we think about budget, we think not only about the district overall, but also in terms of how it affects individual school budgets as well. So taking one step back, we know that this past summer, CPS passed its budget. So that's going to be its operating budget. Also, we were talking about capital improvements, also its capital budget. So, building kind of improvements to schools. They passed the budget last July. Now, when that was passed, they didn't include kind of two key potential costs. So one of them is the teacher contract cost, right? The CTU agreement. That's because the agreement is still being negotiated. So there was no money put in for this year's budget to pay for that. So CPS knows they're going to have to come back and do an amended budget that incorporates the new costs that are coming from the CTU agreement. There's also a more kind of controversial expense. There is a payment that the city, and we're going to get into this a little bit deeper, the city used to make on behalf of CPS that no longer makes on or is asking CPS, has been asking the last couple of years, and CPS has done it, to make a payment to a pension system. It's not the teacher pension system. It's actually kind of more like administrative positions at CPS. But the city and Mayor Johnson want CPS to make this payment. And it's about $175 million, which CPS does not have the money for to be able to make that payment. So a little bit about why that payment is an issue. So again, the city used to pay for it. They did so for almost 100 years, I think for like 98 or 99 years. Under Mayor Lightfoot's administration, she she successfully had CPS start to pay for a portion of this cost, which is about $175 million. At that point, the teachers union, when the Mayor Lightfoot was doing this, teachers union and other advocates said, that's not fair. CPS doesn't have the money to pay for this pension payment. The city, have been paying for it for almost 100 years. But I think it was an issue where CPS, got about $2.8 billion from the federal government for COVID relief funds, and they had the money essentially to make this payment that the city is ultimately legally obligated to make. This pension payment, I think everybody here knows, was a big reason why back in October, the prior board of directors, the Board of Education that Mayor Johnson had appointed, resigned. Mayor Johnson wanted these board members to pass a CPS budget that assumed CPS was going to make this pension payment cost, and they refused to do so. They refused to do so because they essentially said in their role as a CPS board member, they couldn't kind of in good conscience make this payment that they believe the city is ultimately responsible for making. Or if the city really wants CPS to make it, the city should give the money to CPS and then CPS can make it. So very, very controversial topic that I believe is going to continue to be a source of controversy that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So between the cost of the teacher's contract and between the cost potentially of this pension payment, we're looking at over $300 million of new expenses that CPS would have to accommodate this fiscal year. So that means that when they have a budget amendment, they're saying, all right, we have to expand the budget by, it could be the cost of teachers contract, it could be the cost of teachers contract plus the pension payment. And now we have to decide how we're going to pay for that. Now, what the mayor has said is the mayor does not want any program or staff cuts. So basically to cut your expenses to pay for these new costs that will be coming up. One of the things the mayor has been asking CPS to explore and to look at is to borrow, is to have a loan that would cover these new costs. So the cost of teachers contract and potentially the cost of the pension payment as well. CTU has kind of gone a little bit, kind of back and forth on this. They have previously supported CPS taking a loan to make the payments, so there would be no cuts this year to staff or to programs. They've also said, CPS should look at its reserves to maybe paying some of these payments. So think about your reserves like your savings account potentially. What CPS has said is, look, I mean, they have said we, I think this is CPS's own words. They said that they are the largest junk bond issuer in the country. CPS's financials are very, very fragile. They're still paying interest payments on lots of bad loans that CPS took out in the past. And they said, we don't want to do what we did in the past, which is essentially take out a long-term loan to pay for this year's operating expenses, to pay for this year's costs. I think that they likened it to essentially taking out a mortgage to be able to pay, your credit card payment. Essentially, is how they kind of made it akin to. So you're getting some kind of short-term cash that you get to pay over a very long period of time at a high interest rate, but you're doing it to prevent having to make any cuts for like the current year and to pay for those costs. They've also said when it comes to reserves, they've got about $66 million of reserves, which sounds like a lot of money, but just remember, CPS's budget is about $10 billion. $10 billion. So $66 million. It costs CPS about $14 to $15 million to operate one day of school. So their reserves, their piggy bank, their savings account is about worth 3 days of school. So they're saying we can't dip into those reserves to be able to cover the cost of the pension payment and also for the teacher's contract. Now, I think one thing before we get into this conversation is the mayor did give CPS more what we call kind of TIF surplus. And TIF surplus is, there's things called tax increment financing districts. I won't go super in the weeds there, but this is essentially unused money that the city did not use to pay for capital TIF, to pay for capital projects. So basically, the city gave CPS about $140 million more dollars than they expected to get from the city, which is great news. And what's great about that is that it could actually fund the entire teacher's contract, that $140 million. So they could do a budget amendment, they could pay for the teacher's contract for this year, call it a day, no cuts, no loan, call it a day. What is causing some of the challenges is this loan, is the pension payment. The pension payment, CPS has no way to pay for that. So that's a little bit the reason why the mayor and the city hall has been asking CPS to potentially take out a loan to make these payments. The problem with a loan is that CPS, and we kind of talked about it already, but CPS already pays a lot of money to banks based on, I would say, probably not great financial decisions in the past. So when I talked about that $10 billion budget, right, about $8.5 billion of that budget goes to operating expenses. So teachers, salaries, benefits, programs, CTE programs, magnet, STEM, special education services, clinicians, all of that's your operating expenses. CPS has about $600 million for capital. So capital meaning, a new roof or a new playground or new kind of building changes, to a school, building improvements. CPS also pays about $800 million to banks to cover the cost of borrowing from prior school years. So that is about $2,200 per student. That is money that CPS has that they take and they give it to banks to pay for old financial decisions that could have been money that could be going to the classrooms to pay for different things for CPS students. And so what CPS is saying, if we take out another loan to pay for this year's expenses, that is going to cost us even more money. And it is going to divert even more money away from the classroom. So yes, it helps us get through this year without any cuts or any program, cuts to personnel, cuts to programs, but it is not a good decision for CPS over the long term. So again, we talked about this, but CPS is going to have to come back at some point this year to amend its budget to incorporate these new costs. So that's going to include the teacher's contract. Once that gets done, those costs need to be covered. Now, the good news is, as I said, that the extra money from the city through the TIF surplus, that will cover the cost of the teacher's contract. The issue is probably this $165 million pension payment, because again, CPS does not have any money to make that payment. And then they have to take a look at other things. Do they have to make cuts, which the mayor says he does not want them to do? Do they have to make a loan, which people are concerned about what that could mean for CPS's credit rating and what it could mean for new kind of loan related costs for the future as well. So, and again, this is, not exactly the most cheerful news, but I just want to, again, kind of frame some of these discussions as well. So we know that CPS, starting next year, before adding any new costs, has about a $500 million deficit. So that's $500 million that they will have to, CPS is legally required to have a balanced budget at the end of the fiscal year. Now, out of a $10 billion budget, $500 million sounds like a lot. It is a lot. Don't get me wrong, it is a lot. But there's things that CPS could potentially kind of manage costs over the course of the year that wouldn't require any cuts potentially based on the $500 million deficit. Now, when you add the contract, the teacher's contract, and you add that pension payment, now you're looking at a deficit of over $800 million. If you take out a loan to pay for those two things for this year, you're going to be adding millions of more dollars as well. And you could be even getting closer. I mean, CPS has shared some of these projections, but even closer to $1 billion deficit for next year. So again, you do that loan this year, helps you get through this year. No, no cuts, no personnel cuts, no program cuts, but you're going to be paying for it in future years, including next year, if you make that decision. One of the sobering things, and this is kind of changing by the day, so I want to acknowledge that, CPS receives about 30% of its funding from the state of Illinois. And so typically CPS has been receiving about $30 to $60 million of new money from the state every single year. Now, Kids for Chicago, other advocates in the city have been asking the state to increase the amount of funding that it gives to all school districts. This is through something that's called the evidence-based funding formula. If you're part of the evidence-based funding formula campaign, you can do this presentation next time. But I think that the challenge here is that the state right now is saying that they're facing a $3 billion deficit. So they are committing to funding all school districts with $350 million of new money. But again, CPS only gets about 30 to 60 million of that new money. So about 10 to 20% of that new money. The good news is that we just saw in the news today that Governor Pritzker is having a more optimistic view of what Illinois' deficit might be going into next year. So we will see. The governor will be speaking tomorrow. He does like a state of the state. He'll be announcing his budget recommendations. Ultimately, though, it's the state legislature that gets to approve the budget in the end, with the governor eventually signing it. So we will hear more in the next few days, the next few weeks about the state's budget situation. But the point that we really want you to take away here is that right now, it doesn't look like there's a lot of new money that might be coming to CPS to address that deficit from the state at this particular time. So I'm going to pause there and also acknowledge that this is the end of like the content for this evening's conversation. But just to recap, we talked about the teachers' agreement, the teachers' union agreement, what the sides typically negotiate over, what the process typically is, where the sides have found agreement thus far. Talked about the fact finder's report and the recommendation the fact finder made on certain issues, increased librarians, agreeing with CTU proposal, but agreeing with CPS's proposal about the cost of living increases that both CPS and CTU have been negotiating over. Also talked about some of the unresolved issues that are still kind of sticking points between CPS and CTU. And again, also wanted to paint a picture of how these negotiations impact CPS's budget, both this year, in addition to that pension payment that CPS does not have money for, but also what the financial situation looks like for CPS this year and how the state's funding situation is kind of putting pressure on the public school district here in Chicago as well. So a lot to talk about. And I've been doing almost all the talking, which I apologize for. But would love if anyone have any questions or any comments or anything they want to raise before we kind of shift to the conclusion of tonight's living room conversation. See the chat. So the chat, or you can raise your hand. But there's no questions. I mean, this was very much a presentation about here's where things are, right? I mean, we can go back to our metrics for success. One of our goals here, our reasons for being at Kids for Chicago is to steward the facts. And in this case, we really wanted to make sure that the parents that attended this evening and tomorrow night for La Sala, you'll have an update on where things are in the negotiations, including some of the implications for your children's school. So you think about staffing a child's school, librarians, other staff that are included in negotiations. We want to share the fact finders report and to show, I think that there's kind of there's some opportunities for the two sides to I think have a agreement on some issues if both sides give a little bit, which is kind of how it always works in a good negotiation. But then I think also we really want to make sure that parents have an understanding for the remainder of this school year, what the budget situation looks like. We know that CPS is going to have to do an amended budget, and then also preview what some of the budget challenges for next year. So looking at Anthony Garcia's question, can CPS look into loan forgiveness or being approved to not pay back the full amount on these loans? So I think a question is for, like, you talking about the old loans that CPS did or potentially the new one that they're looking into? The old loans, yeah. I would say, I mean, one thing that I did hear from, I mean, there has been, I think CTU has encouraged, I would say, CPS to potentially try to renegotiate some of those loans or to maybe try to take legal action. This goes even back to things that were happening like in the 2000s at CPS. I'm not sure what the legal kind of status is on those, if CPS has explored that or not. I would assume, be careful when you assume. I would assume that they have probably tried to look at everything possible over the last 10 to 15 years to try to claw back some of that money. I will say one thing, Anthony, that I did hear is that the loan rates that CPS has right now on that old debt is fixed. Those are fixed rates. So even if CPS, let's just say they take out a new loan and their credit gets downgraded further, those interest rates can't go up. So they would be fixed. Now, the interest rate on the new loan can go up. The interest rates on some other kind of borrowing that CPS does that's more kind of short-term borrowing, those can go up. So those will increase costs. But it's a good question, Anthony. We can certainly take a look at it, and I can ask some of the folks that we sometimes communicate with at CPS if they pursued kind of legal options around either looking at loan forgiveness or your question about not paying back the full amount on those loans. But good question. Thank you. I mean, think about like, with a mortgage or with a car payment, right? You're able to refinance, you're able to do different things. And I think what CPS's position is, the better financially CPS looks to the market, they are able to do some, maybe not loan forgiveness, but they are able to kind of reduce their interest rate. I think their concern is if they keep on doing what they would say is kind of like risky tactics, like taking out a loan to pay for, immediate expenses, that hurts their ability to renegotiate some of that old debt to get a better interest rate. That would probably be their position. Any other questions or concerns or comments or anything to add? All right. Going once, going twice. All right. I will turn it back over to LaShawn. Oh, I gotta go back to where I was in the presentation. My apologies, guys.
Oh, good. Thanks, Hal. I also dropped this in the chat. So before we leave, we'd like you all to help us so that it can inform us on how we did and also future living room session. So please complete this 2-minute survey. I dropped it in chat. You will also see it on the screen. That QR code will take you to the link as well. I will give everyone a few seconds to pull that up on your phones. And then we'll close out with a couple of quick announcements.
We'll wait until Evelyn tells us that we can. Thank you, Anthony.
That's 80 plus 1.
Got 3. I'd love to get a few more. Remember, this is just really helpful to us, just to improve. We read through all the survey responses. So thank you, Carrie. We need our survey taking music to come back. 5. Great. Put link again in the chat. Oh, thank you, Yadira. Good to see you.
So I have 6 who completed the survey. I think it's safe to say that we can move forward.
Sounds good. Thank you, Evelyn.
Mhm.
Okay, friends, a couple of quick announcements, and then we do have a fun raffle. Before we head out, reminder to RSVP for our next living room, which will be on Tuesday, March 18th. And the topic will be on preparing for upcoming parent-teacher conferences. If this topic was really interesting to you and you think there are other parents in your network that could benefit from hearing it, please let us know. We would love to share this information with your parent network. You can always follow up with us via email, or if you want to stick around at the end and raise your hand to chat with us, we can make that happen as well. And then if this is your first time, if you could throw into the chat first time or even raise your hand, we want to acknowledge. Thank you for being here with us. We also just want to make a note of that on our side so that we can follow up with you. And then before we go to the raffle, are there any other announcements, resources, or events to share with this group from the parents in this room? And if there is, you can raise your hand or throw it in the chat as well.